Great, good afternoon, everybody. It's 3 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. So hello and welcome to the Sunshine State Digital Network Introduction to Conscious Editing Series Part 1. My name is Kayla Sayas-Luis, and I am the SSDN coordinator. So a few notes for today's webinar. Please put any questions you may have in the chat box for our presenter. We will have time for questions at the end of the presentation. And should we need to stream to Facebook, we'll also be taking questions in the comment section there. We do have automatic captioning enabled for this Zoom session, so there may be some transcription errors since it is automatic. You can view or hide captions at the bottom of your screen by clicking on the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. So now I am very happy to introduce our speaker for today. Dorothy Berry is currently the inaugural Digital Collections Program Manager at the Houghton Library at Harvard University, where she oversees both large-scale digitization and the creation of new scans serving patron research needs. Following an MLS and an MA in ethnomusicology, both from Indiana University, she has built a career focused on improving access to African American cultural heritage materials and primary sources relating to Black history through enhanced description and improved digital discovery. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Dorothy.
Great. Thanks everybody for taking time this afternoon for this webinar, Conscious Editing, Enhancing Diversity and Discovery, brought to us by Kayla at the Sunshine Digital Network. So I'm really glad to be with you all here and to share this introduction to conscious editing. While I appreciate the gracious introduction I received from Kayla, who's been a fantastic organizer for this series, I wanted to give a little background on myself before we begin talking about some things that may be a little bit challenging and that do have a lot to do with individual subjectivity. I'm coming to you all from my home in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but I've lived across the US. I grew up in the Missouri Ozarks, and a lot of my childhood was spent in the house that you see pictured here. The kiddos on the porch are my dad and my uncles and my great-grandmother. As you can imagine, it's been a long road from there to Harvard, but I've been deeply interested in the past few years of how our descriptive decisions affect people across the country with different experiences and how they affect our patrons and reflect our historical biases. Yesterday, I was on a call with some fantastic colleagues, including my colleague Jesse Erickson, who does a lot of amazing research on 19th century literature. One of the things he was mentioning was that even when he's doing research on Western European 19th century literature, his subjectivity as a Black man and his lived experience is always part of his work. And I think that it's really important for all of us to remember, regardless of our backgrounds, that our individual lived experiences and subjectivities are a huge impact on the work that we do. This webinar is going to cover a lot of ground, though it is designed to be very introductory. So I want to begin by laying out my discussion plan for all of you. First, I want to get us on the same page for terminology. Our field loves authority and control, but it can also feel like there are new terms popping up every day. Making sure we're talking about the same thing is key to getting towards functional results. Second, I want to discuss the positive and productive reasons to seriously engage with conscious editing. A lot of things can generally seem like a good idea to pursue, but it's really invaluable to examine the potential benefits, especially when we're talking about things that require more or new types of work and increased resources. Thirdly, we're going to broadly cover a range of collecting areas that have problematic descriptive possibilities. Every repository has its own unique collections, so some areas may be overrepresented in one and completely absent in another. The goal here is not to give an encyclopedic view of every possible issue, but rather to get the wheels turning on possible issues, ranging from the obvious to the much more subtle. The conversation will end with some more broad ideas about how to move forward with all this new information. The next two webinars in this series are more detailed and focused around case studies and operationalization. So this section is intended to be more inspirational maybe than practical. And following that, we'll have time for any questions and answers. So what are we talking about? Conscious editing, inclusive description, critical cataloging. There are a lot of terms floating around right now that circle a core issue. As a field, we need to grapple with a history of categorization and description designed to only tell certain stories. Stories of the upper class, stories of straight men, stories of white people, and so on. These stories are important, but our focus has created a historical record that obfuscates the beautiful complexity of society and has often erased the marginalized. All of these terms have area specifics: metadata creation, archival description, and cataloging, that all have their own rules, standards, and guides, but we're all sharing the same goal. Our different professional subjectivities shape our feelings around descriptive equity and also shape our perceived solutions. Everyone can probably think of whether themselves as an archivist or maybe a cataloger or metadata librarian or some other type of job in the information field that has its own history and ways of being. Beyond the best practices of our specializations, we are also bound by the resources and limitations placed upon us by our institutions. Regardless, there are ways to fit descriptive equity into our workflows, even if they are less ambitious than we've initially desired. So what is the problem we're talking about here? I briefly touched on issues of descriptive bias earlier, but this issue is more than one just of principle, although principles are nothing to sniff at in and of themselves. We are in a moment where many people who had previously not been deeply engaged with issues of inequity in libraries have realized the extent to which we need to adjust our practices to be truly representative and welcoming. It can be overwhelming to realize the breadth of the work ahead of us, but that can never be an excuse not to get started. The benefits to our users are so great, it's completely worth it to rethink the things we've accepted as normal. Conscious editing improves how diversity is surfaced in our collections and improves discovery overall. The benefits to our users and to our understanding of our materials is worth the effort. The benefits of descriptive equity are, as I said, not only related to the moral principles of equity, but also have distinct practical implications. Redressing our practices can lead to increased diversity in our user bases and improved discovery for all. So I've put out 4 areas that are concrete improvements that come from doing descriptive equity work, although there are also many others. So the first I have is community impact. Many of us work at institutions with a destructive history in relation to members of marginalized communities, even though we often hold the primary sources directly related to those communities' lives and histories. Conscious editing shows those community members that we are conscious of our mistakes and is one of many stakes we can take to earn new trust. Filling in the gaps. We often talk about archival silences. Sometimes those silences are from records not collected or created, but other times those silences are directly related to our description, things we've hidden in our own collection. Diversifying user bases. When we fill in those gaps, we make it clear that we are trying. We invite in new users who previously might have assumed our institutions have nothing for them. Even at a privileged institution like Harvard, I have heard from our very fancy alumni of color, "Oh, I assumed Houghton Library had nothing related to me." That is an issue of filling in those gaps, not because we didn't have material, but because we didn't make them present to those community members. And then simply just better search results. The most practical truth of all, description that better reflects diversity is often simply more accurate, more closely matching the terms our patrons will use for searching. Those are just some of the practical potential benefits to investing in descriptive equity. Each of our libraries has its own internal standards and its own methods for interacting with national descriptive standards. I'm not here to tell you what your library should do, that you should throw out Library of Congress subject headings, though I've often wanted to myself, that you can ignore cataloging rules or anything like that. Instead, I'm going to go over examples from a variety of areas where descriptive practices have often fallen short, hoping to spark some ideas from you on how you can approach change at your own institutions within your own context. Wouldn't it be easy if our collections were evenly distributed across clear themes and we could just schedule out corrections over the course of the academic year and call things a day? That just isn't the life we have chosen, and it's not the collections that we have. Instead, we are greeted by idiosyncratic collecting and descriptive practices built over decades of shifting interests and priorities. This overview is described to spark potentialities by touching on a variety of issues. Before I begin with these examples, actually, I want to share my reasoning for not including citations on these slides and not referencing images provenance, though were all identified through DPLA, and I do have the citations myself. The goal here, though, is not to call out any individual institution, as that is not productive in this context, and more importantly, as all of our collections have some of these issues. Even more specifically, some of the examples that we will talk about may be problematic when removed from their context. Perhaps within their context, there are less of an issue with the description. Although, since we are talking about digital discovery specifically, that is also part of the game, removing things from their context through aggregation. So that's something to think about with our descriptive practices. So the first area I want to talk about is class. Class is often not the first thing we think about when we talk about descriptive equity, but more often than not, our description for working class people is minimal at best and identifies them primarily by their material status in a way that we do not do for archival subjects from other backgrounds. This photo is cataloged with the title, Poor White Family. That title comes from the original, perhaps it was written on the back, but the choice to carry original titles into our records, speaking of non-titled works non-published works that don't have an official title, is problematic one that we're going to see repeatedly in these examples, that we sort of put the blame for these titles on the either originator or earlier catalogers, but we choose to carry through that work. So other examples around class could be describing individuals as domestic servants when we really mean that they were formerly enslaved and remained on perhaps a plantation, describing individuals with interpretive details due to their clothing or housing that highlights their class in a way that's less related to the record and more related to our perception of those individuals. The next example, and I apologize, there's been some issue with some of these slides not showing the picture, which is a little problematic for what I'm trying to do here, but we'll have to make do. So this next example, race and ethnicity. So race and ethnicity are often the most obvious needs, and often, especially in this present moment, are the area we are all discussing the most and that I personally have the most experience working with. The example here, which you cannot see, is from an object titled Various Smokers. So this was a 19th century broadside that had a variety of people smoking different types of pipes. So a German man with a cigar, a working woman with a pipe, and also a Chinese man with an opium pipe. The description for that item begins with simply Chinese smoking opium, and then moves on to describe the other smokers more generally, like I just did, a woman with a pipe. So those people were excluded. Sometimes the individual itself was excluded completely with just Cuban cigars. This may seem like a more subtle example than some of the more inflammatory racial examples we can probably all think of. And I've admittedly chosen not to pick something extremely inflammatory because I don't necessarily want to share that with everyone today. But this type of language is still an example of dehumanization that can feel necessitated by the limited resources available to describe materials in terms of our time, but can cause negative reactions in users who aren't responsible for our workflows, but only responsive to the results. Well, I hope this isn't a problem throughout, but we'll have to do. So gender is another area where it can be subtle or sometimes could be really in your face. The photo that was here was an example of 12 women members of the Japanese Church of Christ and included only one woman, Mitsu Hayakawa, who wasn't identified by her husband's surname as a Mrs. This is a soft way in which we tacitly accept historical ideas about women's roles. Gender also becomes problematic in our collections when we misgender people with marginalized identities, alienating users and misrepresenting the archival subjects in our collections. So another example there for gender can be the sort of thing I just said, labeling women as Mrs. John Smith, women labeled simply as and wife to a man, misgendering individuals, or using out-of-date or offensive historical language to describe individuals with marginalized gender identities. So this whole time, obviously, we've been talking about language, and language might seem like a bit silly to give its own slide, but when I say language here, I mean the way that language in our description refers to the language of the materials. Are we providing access to people represented in the materials themselves, or only to outsiders who want to research those people and community members with high-level English language skills? This is an example here would be collections of materials from an immigrant community local to an American institution that are described entirely in English, thusly sort of removing them even more than the physicality from those communities, but removing them intellectually as well. Sexuality is a complex and important area for description, and it can be daunting, as language around sexuality is often deeply tied to an individual's subjectivity, and we don't always have direct access to archival subjects. This photo is titled Dorothy Putnam and Friend, and the description reads, Dorothy Putnam and friend play the happy couple. Deeper research into the context, as I was discussing earlier, would tell the reader that the photo itself, which you can sort of see at the top of the photo, is labeled a happy couple, and that Putnam was an outspoken lesbian rights activist, whose friend is simply just a name unknown. The casual user, however, who maybe doesn't have that other context, may feel alienated at the perceived de-romanticization of that title. Dorothy Putnam and friend play a happy couple is a way that many people have been, forced back into the closet or assumed to be straight. But on the other hand, this woman's name was unknown. So this sort of use of friend makes a specific inference that can both be alienating to our users and meets that other more practical goal of just not being accurate description necessarily. So examples here can be describing confirmed romantic partners as friends, using inherited terms that are out of date and offensive, and leaving out information that might be included for a heterosexual individual about their personal life. So ability is material that clearly refers to disabled individuals, often comes into our archives and special collections in forms that were not created by the community: medical records, public entertainments, government records. The photo here was of two children who were walking on crutches and was titled only Crippled Children. While there is an ongoing debate about things like people first language amongst disability community, a photo like that could just have easily been titled Children at the XYZ Infirmary or Young Residents of the ABC Hospital. This goes back to that earlier issue of our resources and how we choose to take on inherited cataloging description and inherited archival description, even when it does not accurately describe the material or describes the material in a way that would be offensive to stakeholder communities. So the last example I'm going to talk about is religion and how that's represented. People writing description, much like and with all the other things we've spoken about, are often only familiar with the religion that they have grown up with or chosen, which means other practices can receive inaccurate or offensive descriptions. This can affect minority faith practices most strongly, as it is less likely staff members will have an understanding of the proper terms. This example is one of those issues of assuming we have to use historic titles. This postcard is titled, and you can see at the bottom is labeled, Jewish Church, and has the term Jewish Church printed on the front. The description of the item actually does have the full title for that synagogue, but no language explaining why they chose to make the title Jewish Church. So examples here are, again, which comes up for every single one of these, inherited and outdated or offensive terms, and using terms from a majority faith for a minority faith. So like, for example, not saying synagogue, but saying Jewish church. So those are a lot of examples that have way more possibilities than most of us probably feel capable of approaching at any given point. But everyone has to start somewhere. As I mentioned at the beginning, it can be overwhelming to think of all the things that need changing, but I personally like to be overwhelmed by possibility as long as I know where to start. It can feel like an impossible task to address the thousands of descriptive records in any given collection, especially in an environment with limited funding and incoming new acquisitions all the time. I've broken down a possible path into 3 areas: survey, foundations, and operations. Surveying can be quantitative, qualitative, or both. Depending on your setup, you might want to run a report for searching for certain terms like misses, or you might want to query your staff for problem areas they have noticed but haven't had the time to address. A best case scenario would probably combine both of those options. What I'm defining as foundations are the steps you need to take to set yourself and your users up for change. This includes education for staff, like the rest of the webinars in this great series that will have much more details, and I hope to learn from. And we'll also include internal work, like reviewing the descriptive guidelines you already have, or coming up with new public language around descriptive practice that explains to your users that you are aware and in the progress of adjusting some of your terminology. And then the final is operations. What I'm defining as operations are the actual projects and workflows implemented to address descriptive equity. A fantastic example of a foundational change is the Special Collections Research Center statement on potentially harmful language in archival description and cataloging, created by the Special Collections Research Center at Temple University. This page on their website goes deep on the history of description and how, while the staff know that language changes and they are actively working on addressing issues, there may be still some problematic or troubling language. This transparency creates a conversation with users and lets them know that we are aware of our own shortcomings. The statement begins, as you may be able to see, with contact information, with users who have issues or just have questions, inviting conversation about something that can seem very closed off to those outside the profession. Foundational solutions involve looking at practices overall and establishing new principles and norms for description moving forward. They may also include, and I think often need to include, public accountability, because users need to know that we are aware that we have done things that may be upsetting to them, or that we know we have areas to improve upon. An example of a small, relative to their total holdings, but still greatly impactful project under the sort of operations field came from Columbia University's recent announcement that 1,257 women who were previously identified only as Mrs. Husband's last name were redescribed with their own full names as archival subjects in their finding aid collections. That may not seem like a huge project in the scope of hundreds of thousands of records, but that is 1,257 new opportunities to research women who were previously only accessible through their husband's work or potentially difficult to discover at all. Evaluating the scope of the issues that were discovered in foundations can become a huge responsibility. But what you need to figure out are, what can you do? Do you have a huge collection with problematic description throughout? Is there a single practice you can fix with a search and replace? Do you have a department of professionals and students who can edit at scale? Or are you, as a lone individual, in charge of description, digitization, outreach, and coffee runs? The operational impact of changing descriptive practice is something that requires serious consideration, and you should start with accomplishable goals that integrate into the work you can do every day. None of our collections are free of potentially problematic description, and marginalized communities are not homogeneous in preference. We are all working with limited resources in the best of times and won't reach perfection. The inability to reach collection perfection is no excuse not to try. Progress takes time and education, but we all have a responsibility to do our part. By looking at the problem areas in our collections and making sure we build our operations on firm foundations of research, policy, and transparency, we can begin on the path to descriptive equity. Thank you so much for joining me today. I look forward to spending the rest of our time on questions, and I thank you all for bearing with me with those images that didn't show up with my image descriptions.
Thank you, Dorothy. So if you have any questions for Dorothy, please type them in the chat box for us. There has been a request for a copy of your slides, if possible, with the images. Sure. Okay, wonderful, thank you. So we'll send that out along with the recording for everyone who registered. So I wanted to also share while we're here that the Sunshine State Digital Network Metadata Working Group has put together a list of inclusive metadata and conscious editing resources. It is a starting place for you to do some additional reading on this topic from people who are doing this work, as well as examples from repositories who are incorporating inclusive metadata. So I encourage you to check out that resource list as well. So we have a question from the chat. If you don't know Mrs. John Doe's first name, how would you name her?
So in a situation where you don't have all of the information, I think that goes back to this idea of transparency. And that can either be something like a statement that's collections level that says, you know, sometimes women are identified in their collection, in our collections, by their husband's last name. That is a traditional descriptive practice that we wish we could move away from and have where we can, but in some places we just can't. I think that we often get stuck with these issues of not having all the information we would want to have, but that is the sort of archival silence we deal with. And transparency is usually what our users require if we can't give them the full information. Of course, I mean, I also always recommend doing as much research as you can, but there are those situations where you have, for instance, just a folder of photos and all you have is what's written on the back, and there's not a lot of context. In those cases, I think that, again, having either collection level statements, notes field statements that make it clear to users what's happening. I think that that is not how we've always looked at our field, but especially as the humanities become more interested conceptually in the archives, we are in a space where we can begin those conversations with users who are in fact more excited about that type of information than we might assume they are, since to us it can just sometimes just be like, you know, everyday work.
Thank you. So this is a question about buy-in. How do you get others in your department, institution, and cataloging on board with implementing or starting to do this work?
I think to me that's why there's this sort of, there's the idea of principle and there's moral and ethical reasons why it's important, and then there's just those practicalities. It is important for our users to be able to discover this information, and oftentimes when we are digitizing things, we have another chance to take a quick go through. I think that's why it's important to do to suggest foundational work so that people don't feel like they're reinventing the wheel every time. It can be tough, especially this sort of situations of we don't have any funding for this, we don't have any time to do this. But my question then is, well, then what's the benefit of putting it online if people can't find it? We should hopefully have moved past as a field the idea that it's just enough to put things online. And I would even argue, and I do argue a lot of the time, that the sort of idea that description that is adequate for discovery in the reference room is often inadequate for discovery online. So all you're doing is taking a second pass when you come to this material. I think that these, especially looking at examples other institutions have put into place, is really beneficial as well. So it can feel like less work to present. I think also smaller projects is a good way to start. And that's sort of why I've given those examples of both really big scale things you could do going through all of your collection, but also thinking of what's one thing we know is a problem and could fix. Sometimes you need to just start with that one thing.
Thank you. There is a question about recommendations for style guides.
Style guides, I don't know. I mean, I guess when I think of a style guide for work, I think of, you know, DAX or something, because I work in archives. So yeah, maybe if the person who asked that could give more detail about what they are thinking, because I'm not sure I 100% understand. I also have a question sent to me privately, so I will read that one and then answer that. So it says, in the Jewish church example, how would you balance providing current terminology, but educating users on why the postcard was labeled as a church rather than a synagogue? So I think that that's actually the sort of thing that's deceptively simple. You don't have to use the title from the object as the title for the title printed on the object as the title for the digital object. So I would have named something like that the actual full name of that synagogue. And then you could have in the description field, postcard labeled Jewish church, printed by such and such agency at this time. It was very common to reference synagogues as Jewish churches in this predominantly Christian area. You know, it's just it's the sort of thing that I think sometimes, especially with archivists, we have avoided doing because of a concern of not being neutral, but oftentimes that concern about wanting to seem objective actually means we're just leaving out facts. And it's a simple fact that there was a period in which people referred to synagogues as Jewish churches and sometimes rabbis as Jewish priests. That's inaccurate, but it was common. And so I think sometimes just sort of putting things out there as facts is a simpler way to do it, and it doesn't have to feel as complicated as sometimes it can.
Thank you. So for the style guides, they're looking for guidance around describing different groups like race, gender, and religion. I will say that in the link that I shared for the resources, we have included some thesauri that you can reference around that.
Yeah, that's actually the one of the things I was going to include in my presentation, and then I just didn't because they had made such a great one, was their bibliography that Sunshine Digital Network folks put together. And I think one thing to always keep in mind is that just in terms of a style choice, you're always going to do best work if you can be as specific as possible. So that can mean, if you have a photo of people that you know are Chicano, you can refer to them as Chicano and not as Latinx or Hispanic. If you know that someone is if you know what you're talking about, use that specific language. That's often the best way to represent the individuals, and again, the best way to enhance your discoverability for people that are searching for those specific things.
Thank you. We have a question about if you've been involved in a retrospective project to improve metadata to reflect conscious editing, and how would one start?
Sure. So I have been involved in a couple of them. One of them I was involved with was like a grant-funded project. So that was my full-time job. And that basically was just identifying materials related to African-American collections and checking their description seeing if it needed to be updated. So that was just a full job, which in and of itself is a sort of simple way of doing it because that was my only job. Now at Houghton Library, I don't want to take credit for this at all because a lot of it is the work of my fantastic colleagues who are the head, Adrian Hilton, the head of manuscripts, and Linda Isaacs, our head of rare book cataloging, are doing some retrospective projects. And again, we've just been discussing about knowing we have innumerable issues in our collection. Houghton Library has gigantic collections, and thinking what are things we can start with, because we need to do education so that all of our people in tech services know what we're fixing, and we need to do the physical work. So we were discussing what's something we know. We know we have a lot of these misnamed female archival subjects. So maybe we can start with just doing that work. Let's see, we can fix our misses. We can look for other language that we know is problematic around women. We can see which of our women maybe are not represented in SNAC and make sure that they have archival records. Just those steps. So I think that that's a way to do it, especially when you're in the midst of your other work. So that first example was my full-time job. That's easier because it's not intersecting with all of the other work we have to do. And then there's the secondary part, which is sort of thinking of small projects that you can integrate a certain percentage of time into the person who does metadata's work already. And I'll also just note that, so a lot of the questions, I'm getting some questions coming into me, and there's some that are coming into Kayla, and I think it'd be easier if they came into Kayla because I want to make sure that everyone's questions can get addressed.
Thank you. So someone wanted to piggyback on the question about buy-in. I struggle with having these conversations with folks who feel overwhelmed by all the conversations around a more inclusive world. This consciously comes out in de-emphasizing projects like this. How do you shift the perspectives of those who are not already in the choir?
I think in those situations, what I have tended to do is focus on practicalities. So when I see, like as I was saying, this is important to do because it's important to represent people well, and so our patrons feel seen and discovered. But also, it's just better for searching. I want our metadata to be accurate. And I think that that is a discussion of can you separate, sort of asking people to separate out their sort of feelings of the moment of recognizing that this is a whole world that they've not thought about, inclusivity, what's going on, and what is our job? Our job is to have description that helps patrons discover material. We have not always succeeded in that, and this is a way we haven't succeeded. So oftentimes I have benefited from removing my own personal feelings on this sort of thing and just getting to the meat of it, which is I want better patron experiences and I want better patron discovery, because that's what our jobs are.
Thank you. Is there a difference?
Go ahead. Sorry, I have one question here that I'll just read, that's the only other question I have. And it says, as far as misgendering subjects and photographs, I have some concerns about the comfort even critical folks have with assuming gender of subjects. Unless there's context tied to the collection or creator, we don't know for certain. Is the answer just not to assume gender at all, or just to name that we are making assumptions of our own based off of inscriptions, etc.? So that's again why I said earlier, the sort of idea of sexuality, and I didn't combine them because they're not the same, but sexuality and gender identity are really complicated because they are so much based on the individual's subjectivity. And even something where we could, you often hear somebody in libraries of this world say, okay, well, it's a 19th century picture of a woman. Obviously it's a woman. Well, I don't, that raises this, that's a whole other, obviously it's a woman opens up a door of, queer theorization that is often out of the purview or the intellectual knowledge of the people doing this type of work. So I think that those two options that were put out there by the questioner, both the sort of including those assumptions in a collections wide or a description of what the work you do is, and then sort of thinking, what is the reason for putting gender into this description? Now, sometimes that reason is because I have a collection that is of, 100 male presenting doctors from the 1800s, and then there's one that is a female presenting doctor, and I want people to find that. And I think in those cases, that is a tricky situation, and I probably myself could be questioned and maybe should be challenged, I don't know. My work would probably be to identify that as a female doctor so that people would be able to find that unique situation. But what I would really prefer to do always, and it's sometimes impossible, of course, my preference is always to try to do enough research to find what this is. Why do we have this photo? Who is this actual person? And give that knowledge. But again, no, the point made is a very important one, and one that we, as they say, there are some concerns about the comfort that even critical folks have with this, assuming gender of subjects.
Thank you. We have another question. Is there a difference between describing someone's state as poor versus someone's class as poor? Do we no longer use the word at all, and what would we use?
I guess my question back would be, what is the reason you're describing them as poor? So, poor is not a bad word. Sometimes it's just how you are. This is life. But I think it's that question of, so to use the example of that photo we saw of the family on the porch, says poor white children. It says poor white family. That photo, the description further went on to say that was part of a ethnographic field work around people in a certain area that was marked by poverty. So that information in that description, that it was an ethnographic photo taken by someone who was doing research on poverty in a specific area, negates the need for us to call them poor white family. You could also, for that matter, in that one, I might have even had original title, poor white family. What we know about that is that it is a family that was poor, that was in this poverty region and was white. But my question there, I guess, is just, my reflex there is to think, why am I choosing this language and what benefit is it for research? So, again, even if it's somebody, in the tenements, it's a photo of people in the tenements in the 1900s, clearly this is a poverty-stricken area, calling them poor family in the tenements is not useful to researchers. There's not rich families in the tenements. So again, it's sort of just, what is the reason we're using this language?
Thank you. Some scholars have advocated for maintaining outdated and problematic inherited language alongside and maybe less prominently displayed updated language to prevent the erasure of evolving public attitudes and discourses. What are your thoughts on this?
Sure, so I think it depends on the material. As you can maybe see behind me, I have a giant Burt Williams poster. A lot of my work is around blackface minstrelsy, coon song, and African-American musical theater in the 1890s to 1910. So I mean, I lean towards, if it is actually part of the material, you should keep the titles. But a lot of times when we say, you know, we want to keep the title to maintain this knowledge of historical language, I don't think that we actually I think as a field, and this is not to the individual question, of course, as a field, that's a disingenuous stance, because oftentimes that is language selected by previous employees of our own institutions. So we aren't saying, I'm keeping this title, I'll keep saying the poor white family one, let's say, because that's maybe less touchy than some other things, for maybe. But, you know, we're saying we're keeping that so people know that that's how people used to refer to this. But it's not people, it's people at our institution who entered this. So I think that, I often think it can be useful, especially if it really changes the interpretation of an object, to keep an original title in the notes field or somewhere like that as originally cataloged as XYZ. But again, that really, it has a lot to do with affective response and user experience. So for me, I do think if titles are necessary and are part, like, if it is part of the material itself, that's one thing, but a lot of our description that needs adjustment is not innate to the material, but is from the minds of our previous or current staff. And if we're not addressing that transparently, then it feels disingenuous to me to keep it for the sake of historical record in the public eye. I'm not saying you wouldn't keep it maybe on your back end or something like that.
Thank you. We have another question. I work at a very large media archives with extensive radio and TV holdings. I am torn between the impulse to identify people from marginalized groups when they appear in the collection to make them discoverable, versus the realization that it's me identifying them, not them identifying themselves, and I may get it wrong.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one. But I think, and this is me, this is a very subjective response. I get things wrong like all the time, and then I try to fix them later, or, you know, I'm just wrong and people can know that I was wrong, and that's something I feel generally okay with. But of course, I know we're also talking about the things we get wrong that hurt people. I know that there's the debate about sort of the assumed whiteness of not describing white subjects, but describing marginalized subject, racially marginalized subjects by their race, is one that people go back and forth about. I tend to be in favor of describing people if I have actual knowledge of their background with that information, if I think it will help researchers and community members find material that relates to their history. So I think, thinking of media, it's tricky, you know, but thinking of the research around that, if it's, for example, like a local television station and they were doing, you know, man on the street interviews, person on the street interviews, and they interviewed a white person and a black person about a topical issue of the day, that's very relevant to researchers. So I do tend to lean towards moving in ways we can that assist researchers, and then being open to being, for this particular example, using description that can help researchers find these undersurfaced voices, but also being transparent and willing to be wrong, or willing to be more general. If I don't know that it was an African-American person, but I think it could be a couple of different, say a person who appears to be, or this, you know, taking up the space. But it is a complicated one, because race is another thing that you can sort of, you know, you think you can assume by looking, but you can't.
Have you had experience with successful feedback loops in inviting the broader community to ask questions, provide corrections to description? What sort of process from notice to descriptive update has worked well, especially across a team or multiple departments? Sure.
So I actually do a lot of my work, as I sort of mentioned earlier, has focused on historical material for which there is not a direct extant community. So there is like an affinity community of relation, but not a living community that I would be in active collaboration with for those specific objects. But this is an issue that we've been discussing a lot at my local repository, and something we've been discussing, and I know she's on the call, so I'll be very vague. One of my colleagues is coming up with sort of public Google form that we work with our public services department that they can share with our researchers and that we can post publicly for people to give us their comments. And then we can just have a workflow within our descriptive processes where we look at those and see what can be addressed. And so that's one way for things that don't feel like they're necessarily very inflammatory. Another way I've had this experience that the question is asking about is just researchers emailing me and saying, what's up with this language? And I think in those cases, it's a question, it's just being open to being wrong and transparent and having that conversation and being open to learning. And maybe being open to getting a little bit of an earful because someone's been hurt by these collections. But yeah, I'm really excited by this piloting project we're looking at of just having a public submissions form for language that is seen by patrons as in need of correction. And I think that was a benefit of the notice and page that Temple University set up as well, that it starts off with an invitation for conversation.
Thank you. Have you had conversations around how to handle radical or extremist material, especially in a digital collections display? How do we determine whether something is too graphic or extreme to put online?
Yeah. So I do have conversations about that. I'm actually on an advisory panel about releasing some Ku Klux Klan newspapers. But in terms of graphic material, I guess again, it comes to this question of why is this the material you are choosing to digitize? Who is the research community for this material? And what ways can you protect your users in general? I am interested in the technological and display ways we can deal with that. So people may know that in some places like New Zealand and Australia, Aboriginal cultures have traditions of, have belief systems that involve not looking or using the names of deceased community members. And so when you go to those catalogs for digital collections, they'll see a lot of pop-ups that tell you that you might be encountering that material. And I think that sometimes that can be an option. But again, that's sort of that question of you've decided this material is important enough that you're going to put in the extra resources to mediate the access in a way that protects our users, or that it maybe protects, just makes them aware. So that's always my first question, is the why. If you have a bunch of graphic material, why are you putting it online? What's the purpose of it? And that, I think, tells you how you need to provide the access, whether that be with warnings, whether that be with notes that describe the information, whether that is extra context that is not able to be disaggregated because it's part of the record.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to combine a couple questions related to thesauri. So when we compile descriptive vocabularies for marginal groups or create thesauri, how do we go about getting these vocabularies registered for use with linked data? I think Homosaurus has done this, but what about other vocabularies?
So I'm thinking about how to respond to this, because I will be transparent, as I've been saying people need to be, and say I'm not a thesauri person. I feel like authorities are a thing that's really important to our field, but not a thing that are as important to the actual marginalized communities that we're talking about and their own description of self. And that is an issue I have with the way that we're using linked data in libraries as like a lowest common denominator, evening things out, because identity amongst groups is not homogenous. So I guess that is to say, I don't have a good answer for how we can get thesauri used that way, because I tend to not be a thesauri type of person. And I guess that's why I'm not a cataloger. No, so I just don't have a good answer for that. My apologies.
This question kind of piggybacks off that one a little bit. So what suggestions do you have for aligning inclusive description policies between archival and cataloging departments when they have different levels of flexibility in description and adherence to standard?
Yeah, that is one I deal with all the time, and it is a mystery to me. to be frank. So I guess a thing I will be clear about is that I work with digital collections. So thinking on one level, Dublin Core, and most of the other materials I'm working with then are archival collections. So thinking of DACs. So that's all the freedom areas. And then we're thinking of cataloging with the bibliographic, as a great comment, I guess, that I got said, thinking about the difference between bibliographic cataloging using the given title of an item and archival description, providing a descriptive title reflecting the item in context. So uniting those two areas is kind of impossible because the standards are in and of themselves separate. I think we can think about things like how do we co-locate with shared, maybe local subject terms? How do we co-locate with, whatever approved authorities that reflect communities, which are fewer because of that, but looking into, even though I just said I'm not a thesauri person, but looking into those more representative thesauri and how can we use those shared authorities. But I think that will always be an issue in these sort of shared special collection spaces, especially because bibliographic description is distinctly different from archival description or the descriptive standards that exist for digital objects in and of themselves. So it's kind of like that loggerheads, I think, is what it is, unfortunately.
And we have some colleagues in Florida who are planning a screening of the documentary Change the Subject. The registration link for that event is in the chat box for those who are interested in joining in that virtual screening. Any recommendations to strike a balance between making assumptions in the absence of context, for example, about the relationship between individuals in an image, with the effort to make these materials discoverable to users who might be interested in or searching for these lesser told stories in history? I'm thinking particularly under the umbrella of digital object descriptions.
Sure. So some things I've liked that I've seen, and I can't remember the exact heading they used, but Bryn Mawr had a local heading that was not it wasn't, for example, lesbians, which is specific and is making a clear assumption, but it was something that I can't remember the exact language for, my apologies, but was, basically can be summarized as relevant to LGBTQ history or relevant to this scholarship. And I think that oftentimes we have materials in our collections that we know through the provenance and through the context we have that things are relevant to certain areas, or that this was collected because it relates to something, but we don't know the actual relationships of those individuals. And I think that's an option. I think for digital objects also, it's sort of, which again, and I know everything goes back to resources, and I want to always have that disclaimer that it's a fight often to get the time to do the work that I'm talking about. But the time to maybe give a fuller description of these are two women, they're at this place, they appear to be in conversation. Having that more detailed description can give those ideas, but I do really like in terms of the original question, thinking of sort of localized terms that can put a star on the object that it's related to these materials we're looking for, that people might be looking for, without giving a specific label to anyone in the object itself.
Thank you. If we are identifying people by race and gender, example, African Americans and women, should we also identify whites and men?
Yeah, so for me, as I had mentioned earlier, I do think, so gender, so again, this is the tricky thing, not even tricky, the complicated thing, brought up earlier of this is all predicated on the assumption of gender. So that's there, and it's, think about it, I'm saying to myself. But this idea of men and women is one thing for me in terms of labeling, or has been historically for me. Labeling people as photo of a white man, I never do that, but mainly because I don't think it actually improves researcher discovery. So because of the collections that we work in, most of us work in, it's mainly white men. That's not helping anyone discover the material. I think that then becomes an intellectual thing of wanting to label of like wanting a perception of equality. And I think for me, with my way of resource allocation, I've always thought, if I label this as African-American woman, people that are searching for Black women will find this woman. That's beneficial. If people are searching for white women, they won't have any problems because we have a ton of those. I think also, depending on time and area and context, we get into this same problematics that lace through all of these issues, which is we don't have enough information. It's not always clear who is a white person in a historic photo. So that's another, those are those elements in the mix as well, that they're people that we could read as white in 2020, but would not be read as white at the time of creation of the photo or of their lives. So I tend to lean towards what I have thought of as a practicality, and which, again, as I've been saying in this Q&A, I'm more challenging myself on as time goes on.
Thank you. So we have a few questions related to presenting offensive terms alongside non-offensive terms for discoverability, as well as how to identify offensive terms, how to go about finding what is offensive.
So I guess I want to start by saying something that I have thought is implied, but I didn't actually say at the outset, because I want to, during this presentation, I provided some overviews of a lot of areas, but I gave a little bit of information on my subjectivity, but not full information. So I will say that, as I said earlier, I am a mixed race African-American cis-het woman. So some of these questions we've been talking about around areas of sexuality and gender, I would like to be clear that those are not my lived experience, nor are they my marginalized sexuality and gender, are not my lived experience, nor are they any sort of subject area expertise. So I just want to put that out there, because I certainly don't want to present myself as being the person who those questions should come to in life. In terms of offensive terms, I'll speak specifically around African-American material, because that's primarily what I have worked with in that area. So the question that we got, the area of identifying offensive language is a tricky one, I guess, because it feels like if it's offensive, it's present. But I guess it's present if you are aware of those communities. We actually recently had an example like that, where there was a photo which was originally titled, it was a photo of some Confederate soldiers tossing a little boy with a blanket, like you might do in a preschool class, tossing them in the air. And it said, the photo was titled "Rastus Goes Up." And I had to let people know, oh, that child is not named Rastus. Rastus is an epithet. Because they didn't know, because that's a historical term. And I think that kind of, this question of how do we know what terms that are offensive relates to the larger question of our field of how do we recruit more people into our field who come from different backgrounds, other than like our 87%, whatever this evens out at, 7% white women. In terms of putting language by more contemporary language for discovery, I'm a little confused about the question. I'm assuming that means if it, like, for example, if an object had a title that has a racial epithet, but they also want to include like African American in the description, so that people that are searching for that will get it. I assume, which again, please do correct if that's not what the intention was for the question, but I tend to include as much language as possible for discovery. And also I want to point out that historical researchers often actually are searching for things that involve the outdated or offensive language. So this has come up a lot. As I said, I do this research with blackface minstrelsy and coon song. Coon is a racial epithet. If it was removed from those records, we wouldn't be able to find the music, right? This is a whole genre, because they used to use this term all the time, both in the Black community and outside of it. So there's that sort of question of, if people are searching for, to use a less inflammatory example perhaps, people are searching for the colored works department, but you've changed all of the titles to African American work department, that's going to be just a problem for discovery. But what you could do is have colored works department, and then your descriptions say materials related to the governing of the colored works department, which was the African American branch of such and such organization. So that's what I would recommend.
Thank you so much, Dorothy, for your presentation today and for taking the time to answer everyone's questions. We got through most of them. There's one or two questions that we didn't get to, but we are out of time. So in respect of everyone's time, I am going to go ahead and end. So just thank you again for everyone who came, and thank you again, Dorothy, for your very informative presentation. Please do join us for parts 2 and 3 that will provide some examples of institutions that are incorporating this theory and work into their description. And part 3 will put the action on you. We'll provide exercises for you to practice with. So thank you all for attending today, and I hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your week. And thank you again, Dorothy.